Hello and welcome to our very first Climate Fireside Chat. I'm Becky Edwards and I'm running to unseat Mike Lee in the US Senate. I'm pleased to be joined tonight by Tom Moyer and Logan Mitchell. Tom, Logan, please take a minute to introduce yourselves.
I'm Tom Moyer. I am, in my volunteer capacity, I'm the state coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit citizens lobbying group. In my professional life, I'm a robotics engineer and I do mostly military explosive ordnance disposal robotics.
That's awesome.
And I'm Logan Mitchell. For my day job, I actually study air quality and climate change at the University of Utah. We put instruments on top of tracks, trains, and measure air quality across the city and try to understand, how air pollution is distributed and how we can find solutions. I'm also a volunteer and help out as a science communicator for Citizens Climate Lobby, and just try to make sure that our the public and stakeholders and policymakers understand the science and kind of solutions to move forward.
Well, thank you so much for being here. I really respect your expertise and your involvement in this issue through the years. It's been awesome. While I was serving in the Utah House for 10 years, climate was a top priority for me and will continue to be a top priority for me in the US Senate. I have invited the two of you to join me tonight for a conversation and to kind of discuss some of the nitty-gritty about climate policy, climate change, and to share your experiences as climate activists and climate influencers. So thank you so much for being here. Let's just jump into a conversation. I'm ready for you to hit me with a question and that we can discuss together. Who wants to go first?
Maybe I'll start first. I'm just curious to hear your perspective on a lot of the climate impacts that we're seeing, this year in Utah. We're seeing, huge impacts from wildfire smoke, the drought. What are some of your thoughts about that and some of the impacts that Utahns are feeling today?
I think for a long time, climate change was something that did not feel personal to the people of Utah, to many people. For many of us, it has been something we're aware of and deeply concerned about. But for many people, this summer seems like kind of a pivot point for a lot of folks. They're seeing wildfires repeatedly, hundreds of people every year having wildfires basically encroach upon their back doors of their homes and their neighborhoods. We're seeing flooding like we've not seen before. We've seen people go out to the Great Salt Lake and notice kind of for anew, this is not the Great Salt Lake of yesteryear. This is not the Great Salt Lake of literally even last year. And these are issues that people are starting to put the puzzle pieces together and realize, oh, let's actually trust science, let's trust what we're seeing, and let's put those things together and see that we actually are experiencing right now in real life climate change. And it's impacting so many people across our state. And of course, air quality is something that we've had really top of mind in the state of Utah for a long time. But I think climate change is something that is just beginning to be something that a lot of people who maybe have been hesitant or not aware, they're seeing it this summer in real life.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because the drought that we're experiencing now, it's, looking at tree ring records, it's one of the worst droughts in 1,200 years. It's really of historical, almost geological magnitude. And it really hit home personally to me earlier this year when the Utah Department of Wildlife let people know that as our reservoirs are drying up, that they're gonna be lifting fish catch limits because all the fish are gonna die in the reservoir. And I really enjoy fishing. And so it kind of hit home at a really different level other than the kind of a, abstract scientific concept. This is affecting our ecosystem in so many different ways.
Yeah,
I was one of the people who was evacuated this summer. from the Parley's Canyon fire. We were out of our house for 3 days.
Yeah, and that's awfully scary, isn't it? I mean, you're sort of watching it from afar and thinking where my daughter was had her street evacuated last year in Bountiful, actually. And this is not an area that has typically been encroached upon by those type of extreme weather circumstances, and it's real. It's something that we've got to take seriously. And quite honestly, for Republicans to be in this space is incredibly important. This is something that is not a partisan issue. And I feel very strongly about that. And the work that I did along with Citizens Climate Lobby and many others when I served in the Utah House with HCR 007 was an example of what can actually happen when you play the long game, you're patient in your approach, you work in a bipartisan way, and you actually move the needle forward. That I think has to happen over and over and over again on an issue of this magnitude.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I did want to ask a little more about HCR 007. That was historic in the state. It was historic in the country. And I wanted to hear a little more about how you brought people on board, because that was such a heavy lift to bring people together on that.
You know, this is a piece of legislation that I passed in 2018. It was my last legislative session. And it was a resolution. It was the first piece of legislation to pass in a red state acknowledging climate change in the entire nation. And it was a great pleasure and privilege of mine to work with this incredible group of students who I first met in 2017 when they had brought a piece of language forward to be heard in a committee, and they were working with the Senate sponsor at the time. Bill did not even receive an opportunity for a committee hearing, but the students had a hearing where they presented their thoughts, and I went and I listened, and I was so incredibly impressed by the personal nature of this issue for them. And I went up to them at the end and I said, hey, would you mind if we work together on this? I'd love to see what we could do over the next 10 months before the next legislative session. Let's work together. And they said, sure, let's see what we can do. So we worked on some language. We had to make some revisions because this is a Republican state. And so we knew that we needed to sort of make it had the greatest potential that it could to pass. And then I started to shop the bill around, and I started with the people that I knew would probably dislike it the most. And I sat down with those individuals, my fellow legislators, and I'd say, let's walk through this language word by word. Tell me what you don't like. Where have we missed it? What have we gotten wrong? What else do we need to add? What are your concerns? And I did that over and over. And while I was doing that, the students were doing that as well. They had this amazing network of fellow students, high school and college students from around the state who were also advocating with their local House and Senate members. And the very first person I talked to was a representative from a rural community. And he said, well, I can't support this at all. And I said, why not? I mean, we'd barely even started to read it. And he said, well, the title right there says climate change. That's not real. And I said, well, let's actually talk about this, because look at this science, and he's a scientist by profession. I said, let's just look at some of these things and look at all this. And he said, well, yeah, the data's there, but that's not climate change. That's just changing climate. I'm like, oh, so if we call it changing climate, that would be okay? He said, yeah. And I'm like, done, we can do that. And so over and over, we went through and we took out the issues that were hot buttons, and we kept the integrity of the piece of legislation such that by the time we got to the legislative session in 2018, we had developed not only support, but co-sponsors, bipartisan co-sponsors from rural and urban areas throughout the state. It was remarkable. It passed out of the House committee and off the House floor, went to the Senate committee, the very same committee they could not even get a hearing in 2017, passed out unanimously with these. I hardly had to even do a presentation because the students were amazing. And they'd been working with CCL and teachers up in Logan to really have this perfect civility, and the approach was so beautiful. It was actually really like perfection to watch this. And when it passed off out of the Senate, it was the very next day, the phone started to ring. CNN, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other states, Texas, Alabama, all calling and saying, what just happened in Utah? How did that happen? How can we make this happen in our state? And I'm talking to folks from Texas and saying, well, if you have a rock star group of about 15 or 20 high school kids, I think you have a chance. But the point was that we worked with each other. We took the sort of demonization out of it, and we just actually talked to each other over and over. We had an amazing event the first week of the legislative session in 2018. And at this time, Mia Love was serving as our congresswoman from Utah. And of course, she had been a member of the House Climate Solutions Caucus. And so she created a video at the beginning of this event and was sort of like a kickoff. And we invited all the legislators there. And at each table where legislators sat, we had students and young people from their communities, from their districts there. And the conversations just took place. And it was amazing to see relationships build, understanding going both ways, understanding where people were coming from. And when that piece of legislation passed, we knew it was important. We knew it would be impactful, but I don't think we understood really how much of a foundation that it would play as the One Utah roadmap for climate and air quality ended up rolling forward in the subsequent years. That's an integral part to the foundation of that. And so what it taught me was important things are worth the time it takes to pass them, number one. Number two, never let people tell you that one party or one person doesn't deserve a seat at the table, or that's not part of what a Republican does. Not true. You don't stay away from issues because they're complex or they're hard or they might be impossible. You just work harder to get it done. And that was a really, really important year in my legislative experience. And of course, Tom, you were right there throughout the whole thing. And it was really awesome to see sort of the orchestration of all of these stakeholders and community members and advocates, and of course the students all working together. Was awesome.
That bill took a lot of people all pulling in the same direction to get it happen. Yes, definitely rockstar students, definitely having the right sponsor for that. Something that really stood out to me, I was dying at the time, but it's fascinating now to me that it got the votes of most of the Republicans in the House, not all, and all the Democrats in the House. In the Senate, it got the votes of all of the Republicans and not all of the Democrats. So to me, that's getting the politics just about right.
Yeah, I think you never want to have something that is unilaterally supported because it says you haven't worked hard enough to listen to the other side. And there's just enough work left to do with the follow-up to HCR 007 as there should be. And this is work that I hope to be able to do in the US Senate. And as the two of you look at this issue and you look at policies going forward from a national standpoint, what do you think the issues are? Your thoughts on where the biggest opportunities to make movement are on the federal level?
So the politics of this are getting really interesting now in the Republican Party. For a long time, there were not very many Republicans taking this on. And we now have two of the leaders nationally on this topic in John Curtis and Mitt Romney. John Curtis founded the Conservative Climate Caucus, and he brought a bunch of people into Utah. We just heard him talk about this earlier today. They were hoping for a half a dozen to attend, and they ended up getting something like 24. And then when he founded the caucus, again, he was hoping for a dozen or two, and now I think they're up to about 80. So this is clearly becoming a topic that the Republican Party is choosing to take on. That's about a third of the members of the Republican members of the US House now, including all 4 of the House members from Utah. So they don't know yet really what policies they're going to support. They're starting to lay out that framework now. But I am really excited to have both parties engaged in actual policymaking on the topic.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think as we look back, even 5 years ago, it would be pretty remarkable to think, because remember that the Climate Solutions Caucus started in the House and sat in the House alone. We did not have a Senate Climate Solutions Caucus, and we didn't have this conservative climate solutions, the John Curtis effort. We didn't have that either even 5 years ago. And we were not having conversations around things like policies like carbon pricing and other market-driven solutions. These were not happening. And it's now as we're going around the state with the campaign, we're out in the Uinta Basin, we're in rural parts of the state, Sanpete County and the Washington County, other places, and we're hearing people from within the industry, as well as others, just community members who are really anxious to see an energy future for our state that includes a diverse portfolio that is sustainable both for our state and helps us be relevant in a national setting. This is something people want to see. And they're looking, even folks within the industry, as they should and as they have done before, looking at ways they can innovate and use technology to do things better and smarter and more in a more sustainable way.
And this topic is, one of the things about it is it can feel so big and such a enormous challenge to solve. And some people they feel kind of hopeless at times. It feels like an impossible thing to solve. And one of my personal heroes is Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. She's a climate scientist and a great communicator. She's an evangelical, and she talks very eloquently about the intersection between science and her faith. But one of the things she's really has been saying recently that's really struck me is that hope comes from action, not the other way around. And so, if you're feeling hopeless, the best thing to do is to take a step, call your representatives, get involved with your church on, making your church more energy efficient. Take one step, and taking that step will help give you hope for the future. And so that's why it's so exciting to see Republicans coming to this conversation and hopefully coming up with ideas, because those are little steps of action that can give all of us hope and give people from across the political spectrum buy-in for the solutions.
I agree. And I've heard Catherine Hayhoe speak when she came to Salt Lake. It maybe was 5 or 6 years ago now. And she was incredibly inspirational, and using, of course, her evangelical faith tradition and relating that to some of the faith traditions here in our state, across the faith spectrum, but using environmental stewardship as something that people can feel connected to in their sort of souls. And then with that as a framework, finding small things that people can do in their own personal lives, and engaging with groups that reflect a type of approach to policymaking that, number one, is effective. I think that's the key, is does this group, do these people, do these policies move the needle forward in a positive way can we have positive kinds of conversations, even as we're trying to hammer out what policies should look like. And I love that. I love taking climate change away from sort of this binary choice that for a long time it felt like you were either a believer or you were a non-believer. And even that type of language was very religious in nature. You know, it's either yes or no. And when in fact it's so nuanced, and it is not all doom and gloom at this point. There are many things that are actually exciting that are being talked about for maybe the first time in this level of seriousness that can really make a difference. And you know, the innovations on clean energy and on carbon pricing of course, I can talk about what carbon pricing means from a policy standpoint. I'd love to hear one of you talk about this kind of from the science part of it, but this is just in general, this is kind of high level version of what carbon pricing is. And we hear members of the Senate and House Climate Solutions Caucus talk about this, and the Baker-Schultz plan is also addressing this as well, but it's a market-driven solution that puts a fee on carbon emissions and then returns all that money to the American people in the form of a dividend check. And it's something that I strongly support. And in fact, there was a letter to the editor in this summer that had a bunch of signatories on it from Utah, some federal delegations, many state legislators were signed on as supporters for looking into carbon pricing and seeing that this was a way to keep American businesses competitive and ensure that we don't export our emissions from other states, and that something called a border adjustment for carbon emissions coming into our country is put into place as well. Who could talk about sort of the science and the history of how we have gotten to this place with carbon pricing? Because I feel like this is the first, maybe the most significant thing that I think could really happen in the kind of on the cusp right now.
Logan, do you want to talk about the science at all?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm an atmospheric scientist. I'm not an economist, but I read other fields of science, and I know how to read those fields of science, and it's just really clear. Economists agree this is the most effective way to leverage the economy. You're leveraging a huge section of emissions rather than, you know, and rather than the government picking winners and losers. The free market is very, very good at that, and it's very efficient, and it's actually one of the fastest ways to address climate change. You know, climate change is, you know, it's getting, as our emissions increase every year or don't decrease, you know, the climate impacts are getting worse, and so we need something that can act fast, not something that's going to take 5 years to be put in place and, you know, go through a million lawsuits. You know, we need something that can be put in place and send a market signal so that all the businesses can plan for it and say, you know, where are we going to make our investments so that we're coming out ahead in a world that has that's putting a fee on this pollution. And so it's really clear from the science that this is the most effective and the fastest way to go. It doesn't mean that we don't need other climate policies. There are lots of other things we could be doing in addition, but that's a great thing about carbon pricing, is it's not exclusive of other policies. It's just a really effective way to get the biggest chunk of emissions, you know, to curtail the biggest chunk of emissions very soon.
And
I'm a big fan of that because it aligns the financial incentives for the private sector. I vastly prefer to let the private sector do the decision making, right, rather than having government be the deciders on these kinds of things. But it's very hard to ask the private sector to do that when there's no profit incentive in it. It's hard to ask private businesses to voluntarily lose money to run a cleaner operation. So this just aligns the incentives so they don't have to lose money to do that.
Yeah. And in theory, the dividend checks that come to the American people can be, I mean, they can be used for anything, but the hope is that, and the assumption that many people will use those dollars to do things that they can to continue to support these same kinds of efforts on a personal level. They can buy, a different type of vehicle, or things that can help in their home, whether that's a water heater or whatever things could help them sort of be contributors to a cleaner economy as well. And I think that's a really nice thing too.
There's
Yeah,
a million
it just,
decisions that at every level of the economy that get made on these grounds. So
yeah, everybody looks at, what's this water heater going to cost me over the next 10 years or 15 years, and if you have a carbon price that, if it's using, a fossil fuel, then it's going to be a little bit more expensive. If it's electricity, it's going to be a little bit cheaper. And what's really exciting to me is in the last decade, there's been just this massive breakthrough in technology and clean energy technologies. It has really changed the game. Electricity, clean production electricity is so much cheaper. Electric vehicles are coming down in price. And this is a historic, I believe we're in the middle of a global economic and energy transition. And really, the US has an amazing capability, and Utah has amazing capability as innovators to invent and deploy the next generation of our energy. And really, it's our opportunity to lose if we don't take a leadership role and incentivize the free market to come up with these solutions. Then those inventions and that production capacity, that's going to go. Really, the question we should be asking ourselves is that production and innovation going to happen here in Utah, or is it going to happen in California, which would be okay, it's still in the US, or is it going to happen in Germany or China or the Netherlands? And so that's really the way I see it. And I want us to act as fast as possible so that we can capture that market share that's going to be this new emerging market.
Right, because something like this carbon dividends, or sometimes called carbon tax or whatever, that actually has a tremendous opportunity to cut carbon emissions. Some would say by half, and the jobs that it would create are really in the millions. I mean, this is something that will be huge for our country. You mentioned global. The impact of climate change globally is dramatic in a lot of ways. My husband and I just returned from LDS mission in January, where we were in American Samoa. And of course, this is an island, nation in the middle of the South Pacific, where many of the people who live in American Samoa have relatives who are in other countries, island nations that are probably going to be completely covered in water within the next 20 years. That's real. And even the island of American Samoa is losing 3 feet of their coast every single year. I mean, it's real. This is an island that is basically mountainous. So 90% of the population lives right on the coast. And this is something that is going to displace, not in that island, but people around the world. We're going to be seeing climate refugees and the unrest that happens there. So it's just the cascading effect of climate change for immigration, for global economics, for our military installations, actually, for a lot of these things that I think typically don't get considered when we think about climate on a global scale. They're real, and we're seeing this as members of a global economy now, and as sort of members of a humanitarian looming crisis here with climate change. I think it's incumbent upon us to use the very best minds we can to innovate and to use the tools we have. So the carbon pricing is one of those. Another tool that I think is something that we can talk about as well. Tax credits, that can be a valuable tool as well in helping incentivize businesses to increase adoption of renewable energy sources. A lot of great work is being done in the state of Utah on clean energy, renewable energy. And I've seen tax credits during my time in the legislature be used in many ways. And I think speeding up that inevitable transition to a broader base of clean energy, again, within our spectrum of energy portfolio here in the state, I think it just makes sense to use existing tax incentives and to look at that as an option as well throughout the state.
I wanted to ask you a little bit about our rural communities. We talked about the rapid transition to clean energy. The economics of electricity have shifted dramatically in the last decade or so. Coal is becoming less economic. Renewables and natural gas are becoming more. And some of the energy producing areas of our state are already suffering economically. So in this transition that is already happening, how can we best take care of them in such a way that does not slow us down in switching to cleaner energy sources?
Well, thanks for that question, because I think we really want to make sure that our rural communities, who are probably those who are going to be potentially hit hardest as we expand our energy portfolio to include more renewables, more clean energy, we want to make sure that they're not left behind in terms of job opportunities and also what those communities look like in the future. And so, we'll put this on a link somewhere so people can read this, but the 2015 Envision Utah data showed that climate and clean energy is continually a top 10 priority for Utahns, both rural and urban, and that rural Utahns want a clean, affordable, and resilient energy supply. They understand that things are moving. There is a shift and a movement towards, as I said, an increasing diversity within the energy portfolio, more than what we've been seeing over the past 50 years. That things are going to look different. And in Utah, what we can do is and people are doing this well, is they're using natural gas as a base power supply to keep costs reasonable as we're making transitions. And I think we can do more of that. We saw that actually in the Uinta Basin when we were out there maybe a month ago. We saw land use being used in a unique way for renewables and also for natural gas wells. It's tricky in a lot of places because it requires, again, a deep commitment to not just environmental concerns, but also land use. This is a time when really all voices need to come to the table and have these conversations. I was in a meeting the other day with a county commissioner from a rural community where this community is deeply engaged in energy production. And that this commissioner was talking about how, of course, the exiting of his own children who had left this community they had grown up in and had found jobs elsewhere because of the future and the sort of dire situation that they're seeing in their hometown and their county. And he was pleading with this was a clean energy conversation that I was part of, and he was pleading with people there saying, help me help my community, help me help my county. Basically, we want to be part of this conversation. We want to be part of the next wave of energy production, but it has to be sustainable. You have to think of all of the pieces of this, not just walking in with, a wind farm or other clean energy. What type of education goes into this in order to help people be prepared to work in that job sector, and what type of other infrastructure is going to be required? So whatever transitioning that we're hoping happens, we have to support our rural communities with the infrastructure, education, and other supports they need to, first of all, innovate from within their own industries. Second of all, support the broadening of energy portfolio within those communities, and then have a long-term conversation about how to keep them vibrant and relevant, because we need them. We need those folks.
And the reality is, a lot of the clean energy production that's happening now is happening in red states. Red states are leading the way with clean energy production. Wind and solar are being deployed, throughout the country, and it really points to this opportunity. And clean energy production or energy production anywhere contributes to the tax base of the community, and so that's something that's really important to the finances of the people that live there, and to support the tax base of where they live.
Yeah, absolutely. I just cannot express enough how much I appreciate the two of you being here this evening and participating in this conversation. Again, climate is an incredibly important issue for the future of our state. It has national implications and even global implications that we have just begun to touch upon. It has been such a pleasure to talk to both of you, and I would love to have the two of you share where people could find you if they want to know more information. And I look forward to continuing to connect with you more throughout our campaign. I feel like we just scratched the surface. We need to talk more. So maybe we'll have like a revisit this in the future, but thank you for taking time to be here tonight. And please tell people where they can find you. Logan, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm on Twitter. It's at Logan E. Mitchell. And also I'm at the university. I give talks fairly frequently. And just today I gave a talk to the Utah Environmental Health Association on the history of air quality in Utah. And so I'm just around, and I guess there's all sorts of interest in air quality, and so there's frequently news stories. Earlier this week, or maybe it was last week, there was an article about how air quality is affecting athletics, and so I was interviewed in that as well. So that's where you can find me.
Awesome.
And you can get information on Citizens Climate Lobby at citizensclimatelobby.org. And I'm also on Twitter. It's the only social media I do. It's at Tom Moyer UT. And hope to continue the conversation.
Yeah, this would be great. I would really encourage listeners to reach out and start to just follow. Logan, you mentioned that one of the acts of the people can do to avoid despair and sort of the gloom and doom that sometimes is associated with feeling like climate change and what does this really mean for us. One of those things is to actually act, and something really easy people can do is to just begin to follow some trusted voices on this issue. And I just want to give both of you my high recommendation for listeners to actually trust the science that is behind what the two of you are engaged with, and how much even just that simple act, I think, can really begin to feel empowering for people to know that good things are happening, and that there are a lot of groups in the community for people to join and participate in. Listening to something like this or other podcasts, or joining community groups who are kind of aligned around climate or clean air, I think can provide a lot of support and encouragement for people around this issue. So thank you again so much for being with us. And I appreciate all you do. Keep up the good work, and let's have part 2 of the Logan, Tom, and Becky Edwards show soon. Thank you so much for being here.
Sounds great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye.